Well, let's return to Brexit now, and in particular what the public think about it. Following an ICM poll a week ago, we've seen growing speculation about whether the public might back a referendum on the deal that the government eventually strikes with the EU. The prospects for a second referendum were among the subjects, in fact, discussed last week at a conference in London, along with research suggesting that opinions of Leavers and Remainers are becoming increasingly polarised. The event was organised by a group of academics called the UK in a Changing Europe. Based at King's College London, they offer what they describe as impartial analysis on matters relating to Brexit. And our reporter John Beesley went along to find out more.
Welcome everyone to the first UK in a Changing Europe public event of this year. This is an event that's being held in collaboration with the British Election Study. And for those of you who aren't...
A room in an opulent Georgian terrace in St James. This was once the German embassy. Now academics, journalists and the odd politician have gathered to discuss what the British public makes of Brexit.
Alan Menon, Director of the UK in a Changing Europe.
You've called this event Brexit and Public Opinion, but we've had a referendum. We know what the public said. They voted to leave.
Yep, absolutely. And part of today has been about understanding that vote, because, of course, it's quite important to learn from history. And we've had specialists in here discussing who voted what and how and when for both the referendum and the election. But also, of course, beyond that, there is a very febrile argument going on in politics at the moment about whether we should have a referendum on the deal, whether or not we should have a chance to rethink. And of course that debate hinges on public opinion too. Everyone's watching the polls for a sign of movement. Remainers are saying if we move in a direction where people are regretting their vote, it means we can vote again. So public opinion is still very current in all our politics and in Brexit in particular.
And it didn't take long for the morning's keynote speaker to turn his attention to the subject of a second referendum.
There's a bit, but it's inconsistent evidence of greater support for another referendum, but here the answers depend on the question wording, including not least...
Professor Sir John Curtis, whose exit polls predicted with great accuracy and to the surprise of many the results of the last two general elections. He told his audience that the degree of support for a second referendum depended on two things. The choice being offered, would it be between accepting a final deal and leaving without one, or remaining, or renegotiating with the EU. It also depended, he said, on the way that the pollsters asked the question.
Questions that simply say, would you like a referendum? People go, oh no, not another election or referendum. Ask people whether or not they, as ICM did, you want the chance for the public to be able to make a final decision about Brexit. In other words, this is about putting seemingly power in the hands of voters. Say, yeah, sure, of course we should make the final decision. So it's both how, what is a referendum matters and also what kind of referendum.
But on that more basic question of the numbers backing Leave or Remain, well, Sir John Curtis says very little has changed.
Leave voters at the end of the day are still emphasising the issue of immigration. Remain voters are still emphasising the issue of the economy. To some degree, they're still talking past each other. So the division, which is pretty close to being a 50-50 division, is just still there in exactly the same way as it was 18 months ago.
And later in the day, we heard of an intriguing study which found that the Leave-Remain divide was becoming, for growing numbers of people, a question of identity. Professor Sarah Hobolt from the LSE's Department of Government.
What we see in our studies is that many people have formed political identities around the question of whether they voted to leave or whether they voted to remain. And that means that people now, just like you might identify as a Labour supporter or Conservative supporter, people are now identifying as Leavers or Remainers. And that means that they will also interpret evidence and events and things that happen in a negotiation from that perspective. So they will see things from the perspective of, let's say, being a Leaver, and that means that any new information or any new events that come their way will be coloured by the fact that they've already decided that leaving is a good thing or leaving is a bad thing.
What do Leavers and Remainers think of each other then?
Well, our research also shed light on this, and we find that there's quite high levels of prejudice when it comes to the other group. So not only do people not necessarily politically agree with each other, but we also find that they're more likely to think of each other as close-minded, as less intelligent, and as more self-interested, whereas they're more likely to think of their own group as more intelligent and open-minded and tolerant and so on. So we are seeing that sort of stereotypes and prejudice are also associated with these new identities.
Does this mean that we're becoming more polarised?
Definitely. I mean, what we see is the Brexit referendum certainly has given rise to polarisation in public opinion, not just in politics, but also in society at large.
The Labour MP Liz Kendall was the sole elected politician to speak at the conference, and she recalled experiencing these divisions for herself during the referendum campaign.
In large parts of the East Midlands, the majority of places voted for leave. People were concerned about immigration. They were angry about their wages and their jobs and their public services, and they wanted a change. I remember distinctly speaking to a guy in Corby who said, well, things have got to change. It can't be worse than this. That was the message she gave.
Another expert suggested that since the EU referendum, concern about immigration in particular has become a catalyst for a political realignment based on social values.
Traditional values on immigration and anti-EU views go together hand in glove. And they're rather separate from views on the economy and redistribution and tax and all those traditional left-right things.
Jeff Evans is Professor of Political Sociology at Oxford University.
Immigration has been the driver which has made this social liberal dimension, this social conservative dimension, more and more important. We now have more highly educated people voting Labour and less highly educated people voting Conservative. That's not happened before, and that change occurred in 2 years.
Why then should the referendum have been the catalyst for this?
Because the result was seized by the Conservative Party, who then ran with it. Theresa May became Brexit, and not just soft Brexit, hard Brexit.
It all sounds pretty divisive, but Theresa May's former speechwriter Chris Wilkins was also at this event, and he said that the new Prime Minister had set out to reunite the country after the referendum. He told me Mrs May was one of the few politicians who'd fully understood what the voters had said and why.
What people were voting for in that referendum, in her view, was something much broader. It was about a sense of shaking up the system, of bringing fairness where there wasn't fairness before. And it was just recognising that for too many people, politics had let them down for too long, and that they really wanted things more broadly to change. And that's really, I think, the thing that she represented.
And she had quite a broad platform at the time, didn't she? If you go back to 2016, she was talking about reforming schools, she was talking about reforming industry, she was talking about reforming the way that capitalism itself worked.
Yes, she was, absolutely. And I think it was quite a challenging agenda. I think it's a shame that more people didn't sort of respond to it. So it was a big challenging agenda she outlined. But I think it was the right agenda, and I think that really was what people were saying in the referendum.
Chris Wilkins is still hoping the Prime Minister can recover her agenda, even as she struggles with the process of Brexit and her fractious party. As for the public, well, the polling expert Sir John Curtis told one questioner that they now felt as though they were aboard a ship embarked on a voyage away from Europe, uncertain of their destination, doubtful of the crew, hopeful of a safe haven, but fearful of icebergs.
John Beesley reporting, and given all those uncertainties, we wondered whether the public will demand a final say over whatever agreements reached with the EU. Let me just do a quick straw poll now with the panel. In October, a framework deal, we know, will go to Parliament for a vote. If it's rejected, could the answer be to give the public a say on whether to accept the deal or stay in the EU? What do you think, Anneliese?
I think that currently saying to people there's going to be a second referendum actually could lead to an entrenchment of those very divisions that we've just been hearing about. I think the important thing now is to bring people together. And my concern is I think the government's interpreted for itself what it thinks Brexit means, and it thinks that's a very, very extreme, quite chaotic, sadly, approach to us leaving the EU, and that's not reflective of the result, and I don't think it's what people want, whether they voted to leave or to stay as well.
Kwasi, would it be fair to give the public a say on the final deal?
I think we will get a deal. I don't think there'll be another referendum. Anneliese is right to say it'll be very polarising. But of course, these divisions are across the Conservative Party and the Labour Party. I'd be very interested to hear what John McDonnell's view of staying in the customs union was.
Oh, I know exactly what it is because I work with him, and he said it's not sensible for us to rule out any options. And that's been the consistent Labour position.
All right, although Jeremy Corbyn has been adamant that you cannot stay in the single market and the customs union if you're leaving the EU.
Well, it was because of that theological issue about whether you're allowed to be out and still be in it. We've said we should have the closest possible relationship, which the government is not willing to say.
So there we are. I mean, that shows
the differences
extent of difference.
again.
Yeah, that we've got a policy and you haven't yet. That's the
We've got
worry.
a policy, but
So
you haven't
let's-
agreed
no.
it.
Let's hear from the
You're split.
outsider now, looking in. Robin, do you think there will ultimately, despite what these politicians say, a second referendum or a referendum on the deal?
Well, I think there'll be quite a big job in just explaining what the deal actually means to everyone who may not be as close to the debate as colleagues in the room. So, do I think there'll be a second referendum? I can't see it happening in reality. Would be my feeling.
But then that's October. Who knows what
But who
might
knows?
happen by then.
Yeah.
Thanks very much indeed. I'll be back at the same time next week. Until then, from all of us here at the Westminster Hour, have a good night.